Sometimes a man carries so much grief that silence becomes his only language. Sometimes the deepest love shows itself not in words, but in the quiet work of remembering those the world has forgotten. That's the kind of man Luke Marrow was when he rode into Drybone and bought the burned Calhoun mansion with cash. For months he worked alone, rebuilding room by room, never speaking to a soul. Then one morning he was gone, leaving the doors wide open. What the sheriff found inside changed everything. Names carved deep in the floorboards, each one a life that mattered. But whose names were they, and why did this stranger carry their memory? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The town of Drybone, Colorado, sits in a valley where the wind carries stories older than memory. Founded in 1878 by cattle ranchers who'd grown tired of chasing fortune across the frontier, it had settled into the comfortable rhythm of a place where 3 generations might share the same front porch, and nobody thought that strange. Main Street stretched exactly 4 blocks, lined with the kind of businesses that served needs rather than wants. Mackenzie's General Store, Bradley's Feed and Supply, the First National Bank of Drybone, with its hand-painted sign that hadn't seen fresh paint since the Eisenhower administration. The Calhoun house had stood on Maple Hill like a crown jewel for nearly a century before the fire took it. Built by railroad money in 1889, it was the kind of mansion that made Eastern visitors feel at home and locals feel proud. 3 stories of Victorian grandeur with wraparound porches, bay windows and gingerbread trim that spoke of craftsmanship from an era when men took pride in details nobody would ever notice. The Calhoun family had been pillars of the community, hosting church socials in their parlor and Christmas parties that drew families from 3 counties. Then came that February night in 2019 when a faulty furnace turned their dream into ash and sorrow. The volunteer fire department did what they could, but winter winds and old timber made for poor odds. By morning, only the skeleton remained, blackened timbers reaching toward heaven like the ribs of some great beast. Thomas Calhoun, his wife Margaret, and their twin daughters Sarah and Beth had perished in their sleep, overcome by smoke before the flames ever reached them. The town buried them together under the old oak in Hillcrest Cemetery, and nobody spoke much about the house after that. For 3 years, the burned-out mansion sat empty. The bank held the title, but nobody wanted to buy a monument to tragedy. Teenagers dared each other to walk up the overgrown path on Halloween, and occasionally a photographer from Denver would drive up to capture the melancholy beauty of ruins against the Rocky Mountain backdrop. The town grew accustomed to its charred presence, the way a family learns to live with an empty chair at the dinner table. Sheriff Tom Bradley remembered the exact date Luke Marrow arrived, September 15th, 2022, just as the aspen leaves were turning gold on the mountainsides. Tom had been refilling his coffee mug at Martha's Diner when the stranger rode into town on a motorcycle that had seen more miles than most men see years. The bike was a well-maintained Harley, loaded with gear that spoke of someone who carried his life on his back, sleeping bag, tent, and a worn leather saddlebag that looked like it had stories to tell. Luke Marrow was the kind of man who drew attention without seeking it. Tall and lean, with brown hair that touched his shoulders and a beard trimmed close to his jaw, he moved with the careful grace of someone who'd learned to watch his surroundings. His clothes were simple: jeans, boots, and a flannel shirt that had faded to the color of autumn sky, but everything about him was clean and well-maintained. Most folks noticed his eyes first, pale blue and serious, with the kind of depth that suggested he'd seen more of the world than he cared to remember. Martha Hayes, who'd been running the diner since her husband passed 12 years prior, watched through the front window as the stranger parked his motorcycle and walked directly to the bank. She'd seen plenty of people pass through Drybone over the years, hunters, hikers, folks who'd taken a wrong turn on their way to somewhere more important. But something about this one made her adjust her apron and smooth her gray hair. Inside First National, Luke stood before banker Robert Henley's desk with the patience of a man accustomed to waiting. When he spoke, his voice carried the measured cadence of someone who chose his words carefully. "I understand you have a property for sale on Maple Hill." Henley, a slight man who'd spent 40 years behind the same desk, looked up from his paperwork with surprise. Nobody had inquired about the Calhoun place in over a year, the old Calhoun mansion. "Son, I'm obligated to tell you it's not in what you'd call livable condition. I've seen it. I'd like to make an offer." Well, the asking price is $65,000, but considering the condition, Luke reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope thick with cash. $75,000 cash. I'd like to close today if possible. Word traveled fast in a town of 800 souls. By the time Luke signed the deed and shook Henley's hand, half of Drybone knew a stranger had bought the burned mansion with cash money. By evening, the other half knew too, Sarah Chen, who ran the small library in the building next to the post office. Watched from her desk as Luke drove past in a pickup truck he'd purchased from Dale Morrison's used car lot. She'd moved to Drybone 5 years earlier with her late husband David, drawn by the promise of quiet mountain living and the chance to build something together. David's sudden heart attack 2 winters past had left her alone with books for company and memories that still felt too fresh to examine closely. The stranger intrigued her, not because he was handsome, though she had to admit he was, but because of the way he carried himself. There was something familiar about his solitude, a recognition she felt in her own bones. She'd seen that particular weight in her own mirror, the look of someone learning to live with absence. Luke made his first trip to Mackenzie's general store 3 days after the purchase. The morning was crisp with the promise of early frost, and the store's front porch creaked under his boots as he climbed the steps. Inside, the familiar smell of coffee and sawdust greeted him, along with the curious stares of several long-time customers who'd found sudden urgent need for various supplies. Old Pete Mackenzie, whose grandfather had opened the store in 1892, stood behind the counter with the practiced neutrality of a man who'd learned to read customers like weather patterns. "What can I do for you?" "I need basic tools. Hammer, saw, measuring tape, work gloves. Planning some construction?" "Some." Pete nodded and began gathering the requested items, while the other customers pretended to examine merchandise they could inventory from memory. Luke paid cash, declined Pete's offer to load the supplies, and left without unnecessary conversation. That became Luke's pattern over the following weeks. He'd arrive in town twice weekly for supplies, always polite, always paying cash, never lingering for the kind of casual conversation that formed the backbone of small-town life. He bought lumber from Bradley's Feed and Supply, hardware from Pete's store, and coffee and simple food from Martha's Diner. When Martha tried to engage him about his plans for the mansion, he'd nod politely and redirect the conversation to his order. The townspeople began creating theories about Luke Marrow, the way children create stories about storm clouds. Some thought he was running from something, the law maybe, or a bad marriage. Others figured him for an artist type, the kind who thought isolation would help him find inspiration in the mountain air. A few romantic souls wondered if he might be planning to restore the mansion as a tribute to lost love. Sheriff Bradley took a more practical approach. He ran Luke's license plate and discovered the motorcycle was registered to Lucas M. Marrow of Gunnison, Colorado, with no outstanding warrants or criminal history. The man paid his bills, kept to himself, and hadn't caused any trouble. In Tom's experience, that made Luke Marrow a better neighbor than half the people who'd lived in Drybone their entire lives. As autumn deepened into winter, smoke began rising from the mansion's one intact chimney. Luke had clearly moved into the building's least damaged section, though nobody could see much through the overgrown trees that surrounded the property. Occasionally, the sound of hammering or sawing would drift down the hill, evidence of work being done. But Luke had erected a simple wooden gate at the entrance to the long driveway, and while it wasn't locked, it carried an unmistakable message about privacy. The first snow arrived early that year, blanketing Drybone in the kind of silence that makes every footstep sound like a confession. Luke's visits to town became less frequent as the weather turned, but the smoke from his chimney continued rising each morning, grey against the white sky. In the long evenings, when the windows of Main Street glowed yellow with warmth and families gathered around dinner tables, the people of Drybone would sometimes pause in their conversations to wonder about the stranger on the hill. They'd grown comfortable with mystery the way mountain towns do, but something about Luke Marrow felt different. It wasn't fear that kept them curious, it was recognition. In a place where everyone knew everyone else's story, they'd found a man whose silence felt like their own unexpressed grief made visible. Winter settled over the town like a familiar blanket, and Luke Marrow worked alone in the shadow of the mountains, carrying secrets nobody could guess and pursuing a purpose nobody could name. In the worn leather journal he kept beside his bed, he wrote careful notes by lamplight, planning something that would transform not just the ruined mansion, but the understanding of memory itself. The photograph revealed itself on a March morning when the snow had finally begun its retreat from the mansion's foundation. Luke had been working methodically through the debris in what had once been the Calhoun family's living room, sorting salvageable materials from ash and ruin. His hands, protected by thick work gloves, moved with the careful precision of an archaeologist. Treating each fragment as if it might hold significance, he found it wedged beneath a fallen beam, protected by chance and the angle of collapse. The photograph was badly charred around the edges, water-stained from 3 winters of weather, but the center image remained clear enough to break his heart. A family of 4 stood on the mansion's front porch in what must have been happier times. Thomas and Margaret Calhoun with their twin daughters, all smiling at the camera with the kind of easy joy that comes from being exactly where you belong. Luke's hands trembled as he lifted the photograph from the debris. The similarity was devastating. Thomas Calhoun bore a striking resemblance to Luke's younger brother Michael. The same dark hair, the same broad shoulders, the same way of standing with one hand resting protectively on his wife's shoulder. Margaret looked remarkably like Luke's sister-in-law Jennifer, with her gentle smile and the way she held her daughters close. But it was the twins that stopped Luke's breath entirely. Sarah and Beth Calhoun, maybe 8 years old in the photograph, gazed out at him with the same bright eyes and mischievous grins he remembered from his own nieces. The photograph slipped from his fingers as memory crashed over him like an avalanche he'd been holding. Back for 3 years, Afghanistan, 2020, Forward Operating Base Chapman, where Luke had served as a civilian contractor, providing psychological support to soldiers dealing with combat stress. He'd been good at his work, helping young men and women process the weight of war, teaching them techniques for managing trauma and maintaining mental resilience under impossible conditions. His brother Michael had been deployed to the same region with an engineering unit tasked with rebuilding infrastructure in newly secured areas. It was pure coincidence that they'd been stationed so close together. But Luke had been grateful for the chance to see family in that harsh landscape of sand and sorrow. Michael had shown him pictures of Jennifer and the twins, Emma and Grace, 6 years old and growing up fast while Daddy was overseas. Michael carried those photos everywhere, pulling them out during quiet moments to show anyone who'd look. He'd planned to finish his deployment and come home to Colorado, maybe start the construction business he'd always talked about. Jennifer was looking at houses in mountain towns, where the girls could grow up breathing clean air and learning to ski. The improvised explosive device had been hidden in a culvert Michael's unit was inspecting. Part of a water system they were rebuilding for a village 40 kilometers south of the base. The blast killed Michael instantly, along with 2 other engineers. Luke had been conducting a therapy session when the call came through, and he could still remember the exact words the commanding officer used. Contractor casualties. Engineering unit. No survivors. Luke had flown home for the funeral, carrying Michael's personal effects and the flag that had draped his brother's coffin. But the tragedy hadn't ended with military honors and a burial in Colorado soil. Jennifer, devastated by the loss of her husband and struggling to raise two young daughters alone, had begun drinking to numb the pain. What started as a glass of wine after the girls went to bed became bottles hidden in kitchen cabinets and morning drinks disguised in coffee cups. The accident happened on a rainy Thursday in September, 8 months after Michael's funeral. Jennifer had been driving the girls to school when she missed a curve on the mountain road outside Golden. The car had gone through the guardrail and down a steep embankment, rolling twice before coming to rest against a stand of aspen trees. All three had died on impact. Luke had been the one to identify the bodies. He'd been the one to arrange 3 more funerals. He'd been the one to clean out Jennifer's house and discover the extent of her drinking. The unpaid bills, the letters from the school about Emma's declining grades and Grace's behavioral problems. In the space of 2 years, he'd lost his entire family, the only people who'd shared his childhood memories, who'd understood his jokes, who'd called him Uncle Luke and made him feel like he belonged somewhere in the world. After the second funeral, Luke had sold everything. His house in Denver, his practice, his car. Everything that connected him to the life he'd built before grief became his primary residence. He'd bought the motorcycle and started riding, searching for something he couldn't name in the small towns scattered across the American West. Now, kneeling in the ruins of another family's dreams, Luke understood what had drawn him to Drybone. The Calhoun family photograph wasn't just a relic of tragedy, it was a mirror reflecting his own loss back at him. Thomas, Margaret, Sarah, and Beth had died together in their sleep, victims of mechanical failure and bad luck. Michael, Jennifer, Emma, and Grace had died separately, victims of war and grief and the terrible weight of surviving loss. Luke wiped his eyes with the back of his glove and picked up the photograph again. The image was still clear despite the damage, still capturing a moment when 4 people had been whole and happy and alive. He studied their faces, memorizing the details the way he'd memorized his own family's features during the long nights when sleep wouldn't come. Standing slowly, Luke carried the photograph to his truck and placed it carefully in the glove compartment. He understood now why he'd been drawn to this particular ruin, why he'd paid more than asking price to own a monument to loss. The Calhoun house wasn't just a construction project, it was a sacred space where memory and purpose intersected. That evening, Luke sat at the small table he'd built in the mansion's restored kitchen, writing in his leather journal by the light of a kerosene lamp. His handwriting was careful and deliberate as he began planning something larger than simple restoration. The house would be rebuilt, but it would serve a purpose beyond shelter. It would become a place where the forgotten could be remembered, where love could outlast death, where the silence of loss could be transformed into something that spoke. He wrote down the first names: Thomas, Margaret, Sarah, Beth. Below them he added Michael, Jennifer, Emma, Grace. 8 lives that had mattered, 8 stories that deserved to be preserved. But even as he wrote, Luke sensed these names were just the beginning. In a town like Drybone, where families had lived and died for generations, there would be others who needed remembering. The photograph sat propped against the lamp, casting shadows that made the Calhoun family seem to move in the flickering light. Luke studied their faces again, seeing not just their tragedy but their joy, their connection, the love that had bound them together even in death. This was what he would carve into the mansion's floors, not just names, but the evidence that these people had lived fully, loved deeply, and mattered beyond measure. Outside, the wind howled down from the peaks, carrying the scent of pine and the promise of spring. Luke closed his journal and prepared for bed, knowing that tomorrow would bring new purpose to his work. The Calhoun house would rise again, but it would rise as something unprecedented, a home transformed into a temple of memory, where the dead could speak through carved wood and the living could find comfort in remembrance. The charred family photograph had changed everything, turning Luke's quiet project into a sacred mission. In their damaged faces, he'd found the reflection of his own loss and the blueprint for healing he'd been seeking across 1,000 miles of lonely highway. Spring arrived in Drybone with the gradual persistence of hope, and Luke's work on the mansion took on new intensity. Where before he had moved with the careful pace of someone learning the building's secrets, now he worked with the focused determination of a man who understood his purpose. The discovery of the Calhoun photograph had crystallized his mission, transforming restoration into something approaching reverence. In the mansion's back courtyard, Luke had established what he privately called his workshop, a covered area where he could work protected from weather but open to mountain air. Here, surrounded by salvaged lumber and carefully sorted hardware, he began the most important work of his project. On a makeshift anvil fashioned from a massive stone he'd hauled down from the mountainside, Luke shaped his first memorial piece with tools he'd purchased from an old blacksmith in nearby Leadville. The bronze plaque emerged slowly under his careful attention, each letter formed with the precision of a monk illuminating scripture. He'd learned metalworking during his army years, when occupational therapy had been part of his training in helping soldiers develop new skills for civilian life. The knowledge had lain dormant for decades, but his hands remembered the rhythm of hammer on metal, the way bronze responded to heat and pressure. Thomas Calhoun, beloved husband and father, was the first line he completed. Below it, Margaret Calhoun, devoted wife and mother. The twins came next. Sarah Elizabeth Calhoun and Bethany Marie Calhoun, our precious daughters. Luke had found their full names in old newspaper clippings from the library, obituaries that spoke of lives cut short but fully lived. The work required patience. Each letter had to be formed individually, then soldered into place on the bronze backing. Luke worked mostly in the early morning hours, when the air was crisp and his concentration sharpest. The methodical nature of the craft soothed something deep in his spirit, the way meditation might calm a restless mind. As word of Luke's activities spread through town, carried by the reliable network of small-town observation and speculation, the first visitors began appearing at his gate. They came hesitantly, uncertain of their welcome, but drawn by curiosity and something deeper they couldn't quite name. Mrs. Eleanor Hastings was the first. At 78, she'd lived in Drybone longer than anyone save old Pete Mackenzie, and she remembered the Calhoun family from their early days in the mansion. She appeared at Luke's gate on a Thursday morning in April, carrying a covered dish and wearing her best church dress. "Mr. Marrow?" she called through the wooden slats. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I brought you some cornbread. Thought you might appreciate a home-cooked meal." Luke emerged from the mansion's front door, wiping metal filings from his hands with a rag. He'd grown accustomed to solitude over the winter months, and the sound of another voice felt both welcome and intrusive. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Hastings. Eleanor Hastings. I knew the Calhouns before the fire. Wonderful family. I heard you were fixing up their place." Luke accepted the cornbread with a nod of thanks. "I'm working on it." Eleanor's eyes, sharp despite her age, took in the organized chaos of construction materials, the careful restoration work visible through the open front door. "Might I ask what you plan to do with it when you're finished?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a distant fire. Luke found himself studying Eleanor's face, seeing in her expression the same mixture of grief and hope he'd learned to recognize in his own mirror. "Something to honor them," he said finally. "The family who lived here." Eleanor's smile was gentle but knowing. "They'd like that, I think." Thomas was always one for remembering people properly. He spoke at every funeral in town for 20 years, always found exactly the right words to capture what made someone special. She lingered for a few more minutes, sharing memories of Christmas parties at the mansion, summer barbecues where the whole town was invited, the way Margaret Calhoun would organize charity drives for families hit by illness or bad luck. When she finally left, Luke found himself thinking about her stories long into the evening. The next week brought Billy Morrison, Dale's teenage son, riding his bicycle up the winding driveway with a combination of adolescent curiosity and carefully maintained nonchalance. Luke was working on the mansion's front porch, replacing rotted boards with lumber he'd carefully matched to the original construction. "My dad says you bought this place outright," Billy said without preamble. He propping his bike against the porch railing. "Your dad's right. He also says you're some kind of carpenter or something." Luke continued working, measuring twice before making each cut. "I know a little about building." Billy watched the process with the focused attention of someone who'd grown up around construction sites. His father's used car lot doubled as an informal mechanic shop, and Billy had been handling tools since he could walk. "You want some help? I mean, I'm pretty good with this stuff, and I don't have anything else to do until school starts back up." The offer surprised Luke. He'd grown so accustomed to working alone that the idea of assistance felt foreign, almost uncomfortable. But something in the boy's earnest expression reminded him of his nephew Michael at that age, eager to help with projects that seemed impossibly complex to young eyes. "I appreciate the offer, but this is something I need to do myself." Billy nodded with the easy acceptance of youth. "My dad thought you might say that. He told me to tell you if you change your mind, we've got tools you can borrow. Good ones, not the cheap stuff." As Billy prepared to leave, he paused and looked back at the mansion with an expression too serious for his 16 years. "I remember when it burned. I was just a kid, but I remember the smoke, how it looked against the snow. My mom cried for 3 days after the funeral. She said Mrs. Calhoun had been her best friend since high school." The boy's words stayed with Luke long after the sound of bicycle wheels faded down the driveway. He was beginning to understand that his work at the mansion wasn't happening in isolation. It was part of a larger web of memory and connection that included the entire town. Sheriff Bradley appeared the following Saturday, parking his patrol car at the gate and walking up the driveway with the measured pace of someone making an official visit. Luke met him on the front porch, offering coffee from the thermos he kept nearby. "Appreciate it," Tom said, accepting the cup. "I've been meaning to stop by, see how you're settling in." They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, two men who understood the value of letting conversations develop naturally. Tom studied the restoration work with the eye of someone who'd done his share of construction over the years. "Fine work," he said finally. "You're bringing her back the way she was meant to be." "Trying to." Tom sipped his coffee and watched clouds gather around the mountain peaks. "You know, I was one of the first responders the night of the fire. Volunteer department back then, hell, still is. We did everything we could, but sometimes everything isn't enough." Luke nodded, recognizing the weight of professional failure that certain tragedies leave behind. He'd carried similar burdens from his time overseas. The knowledge that training and skill and determination couldn't always prevent loss. "I've been wondering," Tom continued, "about your plans for the place when you're finished. Not asking officially, you understand. Just curious." Luke set down his coffee cup and leaned against the porch railing, studying the town spread out below them. Drybone looked peaceful from this elevation, its streets laid out in neat grids, smoke rising from chimneys, people going about their daily business with the unhurried rhythm of mountain living. "I want it to be a place where people can remember," Luke said. "Not just the Calhouns, but anyone who mattered to this town." Tom was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of Luke's words. "That's a big undertaking. A lot of people have lived and died in Drybone over the years." "I know. You thinking about making it official? Some kind of memorial or museum?" Luke shook his head. "Nothing formal. Just a place where memory lives." As Tom prepared to leave, he paused at his patrol car and looked back at Luke. "If you need anything, permits, supplies, whatever, you let me know. What you're doing here, it matters. Town like this, we understand the importance of remembering." That evening, Luke worked late on the bronze plaque by lamplight, adding decorative elements that spoke of craftsmanship and care. The piece was taking shape as something beautiful, something worthy of the lives it would commemorate. As he worked, he thought about the visitors who'd come to his gate, the stories they'd shared, the way grief and memory seemed to flow through Drybone, like underground rivers finally finding their way to the surface. The memorial plaque would be ready soon, and then would come the harder work of deciding exactly how to honor not just the Calhoun family, but all the others whose stories deserve preservation. Luke was beginning to understand that his mission had grown beyond personal grief into something that might heal an entire community's accumulated sorrow. Sarah Chen appeared at Luke's gate on a Tuesday morning in late April, carrying a wooden toolbox that had seen decades of honest use. The morning air still held winter's bite, but the aspens were beginning to show the first hint of green, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark was testing its voice against the mountain silence. Luke was working on the mansion's foundation, replacing stones that had cracked during the fire's heat, when he heard footsteps on the gravel drive. He looked up to see the librarian approaching with the careful determination of someone who'd spent considerable time deciding whether to make this visit. "Mr. Marrow, I hope I'm not disturbing your work." Luke straightened, brushing stone dust from his hands. "Not at all. What can I do for you?" Sarah set the toolbox down between them with a soft thud that spoke of substantial contents. "These belong to my late husband, David. He was a carpenter before we moved to Drybone, specialized in restoration work, actually. Historic buildings, old churches, that kind of thing." She opened the toolbox to reveal an impressive collection of hand tools, each one carefully maintained and organized. Chisels in graduated sizes, planes with wooden handles worn smooth by years of use, measuring tools, and squares that spoke of professional craftsmanship. The scent of linseed oil and honest work rose from the interior. "He would have loved what you're doing here," Sarah continued, her voice carrying the particular weight that comes with speaking of the dead. "David believed old buildings had souls, that they deserved to be brought back with the same care that went into building them originally." Luke studied the tools with the reverence of someone who understood their value. These weren't hardware store purchases. They were professional instruments, the kind craftsmen accumulated over lifetimes and passed down through generations. "These are beautiful tools." "But I couldn't." "Yes, you could." Sarah's interruption was gentle but firm. "They've been sitting in my garage for 2 years, and tools shouldn't sit idle. David always said they were meant to be used, not displayed." She pulled out a small hand plane, its wooden body darkened with age and use. "This one was his favorite. Said it had belonged to his grandfather, who'd learned woodworking in the old country. David could take a rough board and make it smooth as glass with this plane." Luke accepted the tool, feeling its weight and balance. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, the kind of precision that came from an era when men took pride in making things that would outlast their makers. "Why?" he asked quietly. Sarah was quiet for a moment, watching clouds move across the valley below. "Because I know what it's like to lose everyone who matters. Because I understand the need to build something meaningful from the pieces that are left. Because David would have wanted his tools to help restore this place. And I think honoring his wishes is another way of keeping him alive." The honesty in her voice cut through Luke's carefully maintained emotional barriers. For the first time since arriving in Drybone, he found himself looking directly into another person's eyes, seeing his own grief reflected there. "I lost my family too," he said. "My brother, his wife, their daughters. All of them within 2 years." Sarah nodded with the understanding of someone who'd walked similar paths. "The memorial you're planning, it's not just for the Calhouns, is it?" "No, it's for anyone who needs remembering." "That would include David, then. He was a good man, and this town was better for having him in it, even if it was only for 5 years. Luke accepted the toolbox with the solemnity of receiving a sacred trust. "I'll take good care of them. I know you will. And Mr. Marrow? If you need help with anything, research, organizing, or just someone to talk to who understands, you know where to find me." After Sarah left, Luke spent an hour examining each tool, testing their balance and function. David Chen had been a craftsman of the highest order, and his tools reflected that dedication to excellence. The planes were sharp enough to shave paper, the chisels properly tempered, the measuring devices precise to fractions of inches. That afternoon, Luke used David's favorite plane to smooth boards for the mansion's interior restoration. The tool performed exactly as Sarah had described, producing shavings so thin they were translucent, leaving surfaces that felt like silk under his fingertips. Working with such fine instruments changed the nature of the job. It became less about simple construction and more about honoring the building's original craftsmanship. As evening approached, Luke found himself thinking about Sarah's offer of help. He'd grown so accustomed to solitude that the idea of collaboration felt foreign, almost threatening. But there was something about her quiet competence, her shared understanding of loss. That made the possibility less frightening than it might have been. The next morning brought another visitor, Father Miguel Santos from St. Catherine's Catholic Church, a small stone building that served Drybone's faithful, along with 3 neighboring communities. Miguel was young for a priest, maybe 40, with the kind of weathered hands that suggested he'd done physical work before finding his calling. "I hope you don't mind the visit," Miguel said, accepting Luke's offer of coffee. "I've been hearing about your work here, and I wanted to express the parish's support." They sat on the mansion's front porch, looking out over the valley where morning mist was lifting from the river that gave Drybone its name. Miguel had the gift of comfortable silence that comes with years of listening to confessions and providing counsel. "Several of my parishioners have mentioned your memorial plans," the priest continued. "Mrs. Hastings was particularly moved by your conversation. She said you seemed to understand the importance of honoring the dead properly." Luke nodded. "Everyone deserves to be remembered. In my experience, that's not always an easy task. Memory can be complicated, especially in small communities where people's lives are intertwined across generations. Some stories are easier to tell than others." The warning was subtle but clear. Luke appreciated the priest's directness. "I'm not planning to judge anyone," Luke said. "Just to remember them," Miguel smiled. "That's a priest's answer if I ever heard one. If you're serious about this memorial, you should know that several families in town have been waiting generations for someone to properly honor their lost loved ones. The cemetery has unmarked graves, children who died in epidemics, immigrants who weren't accepted by the established families. Those are exactly the people who need remembering most. I thought you might say that. If you're willing, I'd like to help you research the town's history. Church records go back to 1881. And I've got access to county documents that might not be available elsewhere." Luke extended his hand. "I'd appreciate that, Father." As Miguel prepared to leave, he paused and looked back at the mansion with an expression Luke was learning to recognize, the particular mixture of sadness and hope that came with contemplating restoration after devastation. "You know, I've been wondering if what you're doing here might serve another purpose. Drybone has always been a town that keeps its grief private, but maybe it's time for us to grieve together. Sometimes healing requires community." That evening, Luke worked on the bronze plaque by lamplight, adding David Chen's name to the growing list of those who would be honored. The weight of responsibility was beginning to settle on his shoulders, not just the mechanical challenge of restoration, but the deeper obligation of representing lives and stories with the dignity they deserved. Sarah's husband's tools lay arranged on his workbench, ready for tomorrow's tasks. The priest's offer of assistance opened possibilities Luke hadn't considered, access to records and stories that might otherwise remain buried. The memorial was growing beyond his original vision, becoming something that might serve the entire community's need for acknowledgement and healing. Luke closed his journal and prepared for bed, knowing that accepting help meant accepting responsibility, not just for his own grief, but for the accumulated sorrow of an entire town. The tools beside his bed seemed to whisper promises of work worth doing, of craftsmanship that could transform tragedy into something approaching grace. The letters had traveled with Luke for 3 years, sealed in a waterproof pouch that never left his motorcycle's saddlebag. 27 envelopes, each containing final words from soldiers who'd never made it home, entrusted to Luke during his deployment as a civilian contractor. They represented the heaviest cargo he'd ever carried, not in weight, but in the accumulated sorrow of unfinished conversations and love that would never reach its intended recipients. Luke had discovered the letters by accident while searching for his journal one evening in May. Sarah had stopped by to check on his progress, and he'd invited her inside the mansion's restored kitchen for coffee. They'd been discussing the research Father Miguel had begun at the church when Luke's hand brushed against the leather pouch tucked behind his camping gear. "What's that?" Sarah asked, noticing the careful way he handled the container. Luke hesitated. These letters represented the most private aspect of his grief, the secret burden he'd carried across thousands of miles of highway. But something about Sarah's presence, her own understanding of loss, her quiet competence, made the possibility of sharing less terrifying than it had been. "Letters from Afghanistan," he said finally. "From soldiers who didn't make it home." Sarah set down her coffee cup, sensing the weight of the moment. "You were there?" "As a contractor. Psychological support for combat troops." Luke opened the pouch and withdrew one of the envelopes, its edges worn from handling. Sometimes soldiers would write letters they couldn't send, to families, to girlfriends, to children they'd never meet. When someone died, their friends would ask me to hold on to personal items, things they thought might matter to the families. Someday, the letter in his hand was addressed to my beautiful wife Maria, in the careful handwriting of someone who'd learned to write slowly and deliberately. Luke had memorized the name on every envelope during the long nights when sleep wouldn't come. "Have you contacted the families?" Sarah asked gently. "I tried at first." "But how do you explain to a widow that her husband's final words exist, but you're a stranger carrying them around the country on a motorcycle? How do you knock on a door and say, 'I have something your dead son wanted you to know'?" Luke placed the letter back in the pouch with reverence. "I became a keeper of last words, but I never figured out how to deliver them properly." Sarah was quiet for several minutes, processing the implications of Luke's burden. Finally, she reached across the table and touched his hand with surprising gentleness. "Maybe that's not your job," she said. "Maybe being the keeper is enough, but they deserve to reach their families, and maybe they will when the time is right. But carrying them safely until then, that's sacred work too." Luke pulled out another letter, this one addressed to Dad, in the shaky handwriting of someone very young. "Private Danny Rodriguez, 19 years old, from Phoenix." He'd been writing this letter for weeks, adding a little bit each day. Wanted to tell his father he understood why the old man had been so hard on him, that he was grateful for the discipline, because it had kept him alive longer than some of the other kids. The story spilled out of Luke like water through a broken dam. 3 years of accumulated grief and responsibility, names and faces he'd carried alone across endless highways. Private Jennifer Walsh, who'd written to her 5-year-old daughter explaining why Mommy had to go away to help other people. Sergeant Mike Torres, whose letter to his brother contained a detailed apology for a fight they'd had in high school. Corporal Amanda Price, who'd written 16 pages to her grandmother, thanking her for every lesson in strength and courage she'd ever received. "They trusted me to remember them," Luke said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not just to remember, but to carry their final thoughts, their last attempts to connect with the people they loved." Sarah listened without interruption, understanding that this confession had been building inside Luke for years. When he finished, she helped him arrange the letters on the kitchen table, 27 final messages from young people who died thousands of miles from home. "You said your brother was deployed in Afghanistan too?" Luke nodded. "Michael's letter is here somewhere. Not one he wrote, one I wrote to him after he died. Everything I never got to say while he was alive." He found the envelope, noticeably newer than the others, addressed simply to Michael in Luke's own handwriting. "I wrote it sitting in the chapel at the base, waiting for the transport to bring me home for his funeral. Figured if I was carrying everyone else's last words, I should carry my own too." Sarah studied the collection of letters spread across the table. "This is why you understand about memorials. You've been creating one all along, not in stone or wood, but in carrying these stories with you. I never thought about it that way. Every one of these letters represents someone who mattered to someone else. Every name you've memorized is a life that had meaning. You've been building a memorial in your heart, carrying it with you everywhere you go." Luke picked up Private Rodriguez's letter again, running his thumb across the worn envelope. When I found the Calhoun photograph, I saw my own family's faces looking back at me. But maybe I also saw all these other families, all the people whose last words I've been carrying, all the connections that got broken too soon. Maybe the memorial you're building here isn't just for the Calhouns or your family, Sarah said. Maybe it's for everyone whose story needs preserving, including these soldiers. The idea settled over Luke like recognition. The mansion restoration, the carved names he was planning, the bronze plaques, they could serve a larger purpose than he'd originally imagined. Instead of just honoring local losses, the memorial could become a place where any story of love and loss could find permanent expression. But I still don't know how to get these letters to their families, Luke said. Sarah smiled with the particular kindness that comes from understanding another person's burden. Maybe you don't have to deliver them. Maybe you just have to create a place where their stories can live alongside everyone else's. A place where Maria and Dad and that 5-year-old daughter can know their soldiers. Tried to reach them one last time that night. Luke worked by lamplight to expand his memorial plans. Using Father Miguel's church records and his own collection of letters, he began creating a comprehensive list of names and stories that deserved preservation. The project was growing beyond anything he'd originally envisioned, but for the first time since beginning the work, Luke felt like he understood his true purpose. The letters lay arranged on his workbench, no longer hidden away, but integrated into the larger story he was trying to tell. 27 final messages would find their place in the memorial, not as delivered mail, but as evidence of love that transcends death, of connections that survive even when the people who made them don't. Sarah's insight had transformed Luke's understanding of his mission. He wasn't just building a memorial, he was creating a repository for every story that risked being forgotten, every love that deserved acknowledgement, every life that had mattered to someone, somewhere, in ways both great and small. Father Miguel arrived at the mansion on a humid June morning, carrying a cardboard box that seemed to contain the weight of decades. His usual cheerful demeanor was tempered by something more serious as he climbed the front porch steps where Luke was installing new railings. "I brought those records I mentioned," Miguel said, setting the box down carefully. "Fair warning, some of this material is hard to read. Cemetery records from the 1880s through the 1920s, when the town was still rough around the edges." Luke wiped sawdust from his hands and opened the box. Inside were leather-bound ledgers, yellow documents, and manila folders containing photocopied newspaper clippings. The smell of old paper and institutional storage rose from the contents. Hillcrest Cemetery has been the town's primary burial ground since 1879, Miguel explained, pulling out the oldest ledger. But the record-keeping was inconsistent, especially for people who weren't considered full members of the community. The first ledger contained entries in multiple handwritings, some careful and precise, others hasty and barely legible. Luke read the entries with growing understanding of the town's hidden history. Many graves were marked simply as unknown Chinese worker or infant daughter of Mexican family. Children who died in the influenza epidemic of 1918 were listed by first names only, their surnames lost to inadequate documentation. This entry here, Miguel pointed to a line dated March 15th, 1894. 3 children, ages 4, 6, and 8. The Kowalski family, Polish immigrants who worked the copper mine before it played out. They died of diphtheria within a week of each other. Parents couldn't afford individual headstones, so they were buried together under a marker that just says 3 angels. Luke studied the careful notation. Someone had taken time to record the children's full names, Stanislaw, Katarzyna, and little Joseph, even though their grave marker bore no such detail. Who kept these records? Different people over the years. The first entries were made by Father O'Malley, the priest who established St. Catherine's, later ones by whoever was serving as town clerk. This section here, Miguel flipped several pages, was recorded by Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the town's first female physician. She arrived in 1903 and made it her mission to document every death properly, regardless of the family's social standing. The ledger revealed layer upon layer of forgotten lives. Railroad workers who died in construction accidents, their bodies shipped home to families in distant states. Unmarked graves of Native Americans who died during the harsh winter of 1889, children born to unmarried mothers. Recorded with discretion, but recorded nonetheless. Sarah arrived while they were examining the records, carrying a thermos of coffee and her own notebook. She'd volunteered to help research the town's forgotten stories, applying her librarian skills to organizing and cross-referencing the historical documents. "I brought the 1920 census records," she said, joining them at the makeshift table Luke had set up on the porch. "I thought we could cross-reference the cemetery entries with the population records. See if we can identify some of the unnamed graves." The three of them worked through the morning, creating a comprehensive list of Drybone's forgotten dead. The census revealed families who disappeared from later records, immigrant households that had apparently moved on after losing children to disease or accident, single men who'd worked dangerous jobs and died far from anyone who might claim their bodies. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a census entry for the Chen family. Chinese immigrants, 4 children listed. But here in the cemetery records, only 2 burials for the Chen family, adults. What happened to the children? Miguel checked his ecclesiastical records. Nothing here. The Catholic Church didn't serve the Chinese community in those days. They probably had their own burial customs, maybe even their own cemetery that's been lost to time. Luke studied the discrepancy, understanding its implications. So there are people who lived and died in Drybone who don't appear in any official record of their existence. More than you might think, Miguel confirmed. The town's official history was written by the families who survived and prospered. Everyone else became a footnote, if they were mentioned at all. As they worked, a pattern emerged. Drybone's recorded history celebrated pioneers, successful businessmen, and founding families. But the cemetery records revealed a different story, one of struggle, loss, and communities within communities that had been systematically excluded from the official narrative. "The memorial you're planning," Sarah said during a break for lunch, "it could change how people understand this town's history. Instead of just the success stories, it could tell the whole truth about who lived here and what they sacrificed." Luke felt the weight of that responsibility settling on his shoulders. What had begun as a personal project to honor the Calhoun family was evolving into something that could reshape the community's understanding of itself. "Some people might not want the whole truth told," Miguel said quietly. "Small towns have long memories, and some families have worked hard to bury certain stories." The afternoon brought their first opposition. Councilman Robert Hartley appeared at the mansion's gate just as they were packing up the records. A descendant of one of Drybone's founding families, Hartley had served on the town council for 15 years and took his role as guardian of local traditions seriously. "Mr. Marrow," Hartley called from the gate. "I wonder if I might have a word." Luke invited him onto the porch, offering coffee that Hartley politely declined. The councilman's manner was formal but not unfriendly, the diplomatic approach of someone accustomed to managing community disagreements. "I've been hearing about your plans for the Calhoun place," Hartley began. "A memorial of some kind. I wanted to make sure you understand the town's position on historical preservation. I'm listening. Drybone has a particular character, a certain way of honoring its past that served us well for generations. We believe in celebrating the positive aspects of our history, the pioneers who built something lasting, the families who contributed to the community's growth." Luke nodded, understanding the subtext. "And the people who don't fit that narrative? Every town has its difficult periods, its mistakes, its regrettable episodes. We found it's better to let sleeping dogs lie, if you understand my meaning." Miguel stepped forward, his priest's collar catching the afternoon light. "With respect, Robert, I think there's room for a more complete telling of our story." Hartley's smile remained diplomatic, but grew cooler. "Father, I appreciate your perspective, but the council has certain responsibilities to the community's reputation and property values. A memorial that dwells on negative aspects of our history might not serve the town's best interests. The confrontation was polite, but unmistakable. Luke found himself at the center of a conflict he hadn't anticipated between those who wanted to preserve selective memory and those who believed in acknowledging the full truth of the past. "I'm not planning to dwell on anything negative," Luke said carefully. "I just want to remember everyone who lived and died here, regardless of their circumstances." "That's a noble sentiment," Hartley replied. "But I hope you'll consider the broader implications of your choices. Some stories are better left untold." After Hartley left, the three of them stood in silence for several minutes, processing the encounter. Luke realized that his memorial project had grown beyond personal healing, into something that could divide the community he'd hoped to serve. "What do you think?" he asked his companions. Sarah gathered the census records with determined movements. "I think Dr. Morrison was right. Every life has equal value and deserves equal recognition." Miguel nodded slowly. "Sometimes the church's highest calling is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable." "Sounds like your memorial might serve both purposes." Luke looked out over the town spread below them, understanding that the ancient cemetery records had revealed more than forgotten names. They'd exposed the fundamental question of who gets remembered and who gets forgotten. The memorial he was planning would have to navigate these treacherous waters carefully, honoring the full truth while serving the community's need for healing. Sarah discovered Luke's military decorations by accident on a sweltering July afternoon when she'd come to help organize the cemetery records. Luke had asked her to retrieve his notebook from the bedroom while he continued working on the mansion's main staircase, and she'd inadvertently knocked over a canvas bag while searching through his belongings. The contents spilled across the wooden floor with a metallic chime that made her freeze. A Purple Heart lay beside a Bronze Star medal, both in their original presentation boxes. But it was the certificate of recognition that made her breath catch, an official document bearing Luke's full name, rank, and a citation that began with words she had to read twice to believe. For extraordinary heroism in ground combat against a hostile force. Below the military decorations lay a manila envelope marked "Classified" in red letters, though the seal had been broken long ago. Sarah's hands trembled as she realized she was looking at Luke's discharge papers and Medal of Honor documentation, the highest military decoration for valor in combat. "Sarah?" Luke's voice carried up the stairs. "Did you find that notebook?" She quickly gathered the scattered items, her mind racing with implications she couldn't fully process. The quiet mountain man who'd been methodically rebuilding the Calhoun mansion wasn't just a contractor with grief issues. He was a decorated war hero whose service record suggested experiences far beyond anything she'd imagined. "Found it!" she called back, her voice steadier than she felt. That evening, after Luke had prepared dinner using ingredients from his carefully tended garden, Sarah finally found the courage to address what she'd discovered. "Luke, I need to ask you about something." He looked up from his coffee, and something in her expression must have warned him. "What is it?" "When I was looking for your notebook, I accidentally knocked over a bag. I saw your military decorations." Luke's face went carefully neutral, the expression of someone who'd learned to control his reactions under extreme circumstances. "I see." "Medal of Honor, Luke. That's not something you earn for administrative duties or psychological support work." He was quiet for a long moment, staring out the kitchen window at the mountains where shadows were gathering in the valleys. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of memories he'd spent years trying to forget. "I wasn't entirely honest about my role in Afghanistan. I did provide psychological support, but that wasn't my primary assignment." Sarah waited, understanding that this revelation had been building since their first conversation. "I was a special forces medic before I became a contractor. 12 years active duty, most of it in places that don't appear on official maps. When I transitioned to civilian work, I thought I was done with combat operations." Luke stood and walked to the window, looking out at the peaceful valley that had become his refuge. But in 2020, our forward operating base came under sustained attack. 3 days of coordinated assaults that overwhelmed our defensive positions. My psychological support role became secondary to keeping wounded soldiers alive under fire. The story emerged slowly, like blood from a deep wound that had never properly healed. Luke described the attack that had killed his brother Michael's unit, how Luke had been conducting therapy sessions when the first explosions hit, how he'd immediately transitioned back to his combat medic role as casualties mounted. On the second day, a mortar round took out our primary medical facility. I set up a field hospital in a reinforced bunker, working on wounded soldiers, while incoming fire shook dirt from the ceiling. That's where the other medics started bringing me the personal effects, letters, photographs, things soldiers carried that might matter to their families. Sarah listened with growing understanding of the weight Luke had been carrying. His collection of letters wasn't just a side responsibility. It was evidence of his role as the last person many young soldiers had spoken to before dying. The citation mentions extraordinary heroism, Sarah said. Gently, Luke's laugh was bitter. I kept 17 soldiers alive during a 36-hour period while under constant enemy fire. Used a cargo container as an operating room, performed surgery with mortar rounds landing 50 meters away. The military called it heroic. I call it refusing to let more people die on my watch. But you were successful. You saved those soldiers. I saved 17. I lost 43. The number hung in the air between them like a confession. Sarah began to understand the true source of Luke's guilt. Not just survivor's remorse, but the specific burden of being responsible for other people's lives under impossible circumstances. The letters you've been carrying, they're from the soldiers who didn't make it. Most of them. Some are from soldiers I treated who died later, in other hospitals, from other wounds. Their friends kept asking me to hold on to personal items, as if I'd become some kind of unofficial keeper of final messages. Luke returned to the table and sat heavily, suddenly looking older than his years. After my brother died in that same engagement, I couldn't continue the medical work. Too many faces that reminded me of Michael. Too many young soldiers who looked like they could have been my nephews in 10 years. That's when I transitioned to psychological support. Figured I could help people process trauma without having to cut them. Open to save their lives, but you couldn't save your brother. Michael's unit was hit by an IED 40 kilometers from the base. By the time we got the call, there was nothing to save. He died instantly, along with 2 other engineers. I never even saw his body, just the personal effects they brought back, including the letter he'd been writing to his daughters. Sarah reached across the table and took Luke's hand. The memorial you're building, it's not just for the Calhoun family or your brother's family. It's for all 43 soldiers you couldn't save. Luke nodded, unable to speak. That's why you understand about preserving memory, about honoring people whose stories might be forgotten. You've been carrying 43 stories for 3 years, waiting for the right place to tell them. I never intended for anyone here to know about the military service. I thought I could just be Luke Marrow, the guy who bought the burned mansion. But the more I work on this memorial, the more I realize I can't separate my grief from my purpose. Sarah was quiet for several minutes, processing the full scope of Luke's background and mission. Does anyone else in town know? Sheriff Bradley might have found something when he ran my background check, but he's never mentioned it. What happens when word gets out? Because it will. Drybone's too small for secrets this big to stay hidden. Luke had been dreading this question since arriving in town. I don't know. Part of me hopes it doesn't matter, that the memorial can stand on its own merits, regardless of who built it. But I'm worried that once people know about the Medal of Honor, they'll focus on that instead of the purpose of the memorial, or they might understand why you're qualified to build a place that honors sacrifice and loss, maybe. But I've seen what happens when military decorations become the story. The memorial stops being about the people it's meant to honor and becomes about the person who built it. That's the opposite of what I want. Sarah squeezed his hand. Then we'll make sure the focus stays where it belongs, on the stories that need telling, not on the person telling them. Luke looked at her with gratitude that went beyond words. For 3 years, he'd carried the weight of his military service alone, along with the grief of his family's deaths and the burden of 43 undelivered final messages. Sarah's acceptance of his full story felt like the first step toward healing he'd experienced since the war ended. "There's something else," Luke said. "The names I'm planning to carve in the mansion's floors, they include my fallen soldiers, not just local people. This memorial is going to honor everyone I've lost, everyone this town has lost, everyone whose story deserves preservation. How many names total?" Luke pulled out his journal and opened to a page covered with careful handwriting. "So far, 87. The Calhoun family, my brother's family, the 43 soldiers, Dr. Morrison, the Kowalski children, and dozens of others from the cemetery records Father Miguel provided." Sarah studied the list with awe. "You're not just building a memorial, Luke. You're creating a comprehensive record of loss and love that spans generations and geography. That's what I hope. But it means the project is bigger than anything I originally planned. And it's going to require more courage than I thought I had." Luke's military decorations lay on the table between them, no longer hidden but not yet fully revealed to the community that had welcomed him. The plot twist of his true identity had recontextualized everything: his skill with tools, his understanding of trauma, his methodical approach to honoring the dead, and his capacity for carrying other people's grief alongside his own. Word of Luke's military background spread through Drybone with the inexorable persistence of mountain wildfire. Sarah had kept his secret for exactly 3 days. Before Sheriff Bradley appeared at the mansion with a knowing look and a thermos of coffee that suggested a long conversation ahead, "Figured you might want to talk," Tom said, settling onto the front porch where Luke was applying finish to a series of wooden memorial benches. He'd been getting calls from folks who are suddenly very interested in our mysterious newcomer. Luke set down his brush and accepted the offered coffee. "How much do they know?" "Enough. Dale Morrison's got a nephew in the army who looked up your service record after Billy mentioned seeing military gear in your truck. Medal of Honor recipients aren't exactly common knowledge, but they're not classified information either." The memorial benches stood in various stages of completion around the porch, each one crafted from different types of wood to represent different aspects of loss. Luke had been working on them for weeks, using the finest techniques David Chen's tools allowed. The bench nearest to completion bore subtle carvings of mountain laurel, Colorado's state flower, intertwined with crosses, crescents, and other symbols representing the diverse faiths of those the memorial would honor. "I never intended to hide it permanently," Luke said. "I just wanted the memorial to be about the people it honors, not about me." Tom nodded, with the understanding of someone who'd served in law enforcement long enough to recognize the weight certain men carry. "Problem is, now that people know, they're asking questions about your plans that they weren't asking before." "Town council's called an emergency meeting for tomorrow night." Luke felt his stomach tighten. "What kind of questions?" "The usual small-town concerns. Property values, tourism impact, whether you're planning something that might draw unwanted attention to Drybone, but also some new concerns about whether a war memorial belongs on private property, whether there should be some kind of official oversight. It's not a war memorial. It's a memorial for anyone who needs remembering. I know that, and you know that. But people hear Medal of Honor, and they start thinking about parades and ceremonies and government officials coming to town. Some folks are excited about the prestige. Others are worried about the disruption." Luke worked in silence for several minutes, applying finish to the bench with steady strokes. Each piece of furniture was designed to invite contemplation, the height perfect for sitting quietly, the armrests positioned to encourage comfort during long periods of reflection. He'd envisioned families gathering on these benches to share stories about their loved ones, finding solace in community and shared remembrance. "What do you think I should do?" Tom was quiet for a long moment, studying the town spread out below them. I think you should finish what you started, but maybe with some community input. People are going to be part of this, whether you plan for it or not. Might as well make them partners instead of critics. That afternoon, Luke accelerated his work with an urgency born of uncertainty. The benches required completion before any formal unveiling, and he sensed that his time for working in relative solitude was rapidly ending. Each piece demanded perfect craftsmanship. Joints fitted without gaps, surfaces smooth enough to invite touch, finishes that would weather mountain storms for decades. Sarah arrived with Father Miguel, just as Luke was completing the fourth bench. This one crafted from cherry wood that seemed to glow in the late afternoon sunlight. She carried a folder thick with papers and wore the determined expression of someone who'd spent considerable time preparing for a difficult conversation. "We've been researching memorial law," she announced without preamble. "Turns out you have more rights as a property owner than the town council wants to acknowledge. But there are also some opportunities for collaboration that might benefit everyone." Miguel set down his own briefcase and pulled out a legal document. "I spoke with the diocese about religious aspects of the memorial. They're supportive, especially since you're planning to honor people of all faiths. But they'd like some assurance that the sacred nature of the project will be protected." Luke examined the papers they'd brought. Legal precedents for private memorials. Examples of successful collaborations between individuals and communities. And templates for establishing memorial trusts that could ensure long-term maintenance and protection. "You've both put a lot of work into this," Luke said. "Because we believe in what you're doing," Sarah replied. "But we also want to make sure it survives beyond your time here. A memorial this comprehensive needs institutional support if it's going to serve the community for generations." Luke felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the recognition that his solitary mission was evolving into something that required collaboration and compromise. Part of him wanted to retreat to the safety of working alone, but he was beginning to understand that healing was inherently a community endeavor. "What exactly are you proposing?" Miguel opened his briefcase and withdrew a hand-drawn map of the mansion property. "Sarah and I have been thinking about phases. Phase 1 would be what you're already doing, restoring the mansion as a memorial space with the carved names and memorial benches. Phase 2 could involve the community in creating additional elements." Sarah pointed to different areas on the map. "Memorial garden here, with plants native to Colorado and others representing the different places your soldiers came from. Community gathering space here, where people could hold remembrance ceremonies or just come to sit quietly. Maybe even a small library of personal stories and photographs." The vision they described was larger and more ambitious than anything Luke had imagined, but it also felt more sustainable. Instead of one man's project, it could become a community institution that would continue growing and serving long after Luke moved on to his next destination. "The town council meeting tomorrow," Luke said. "What should I expect?" "Mixed reactions," Tom said, rejoining the conversation after examining the completed benches with obvious admiration. "Robert Hartley's been rallying opposition, claiming the memorial will turn Drybone into a tourist destination and change the character of the town. But Martha Hayes has been organizing support, and she's got more influence than Hartley realizes." "What kind of support?" Sarah smiled for the first time that day. "The kind that brings casseroles and offers volunteer labor. Half the town wants to help you finish this project, especially now that they understand your background. People are starting to see the memorial as something that could bring the community together instead of dividing it." That evening, Luke worked by lamplight to complete the final memorial bench. This one, crafted from local aspen wood that had survived a forest fire decades earlier, would represent resilience and renewal. The wood bore scars from the flames that had swept through the mountainside, but it had grown back stronger, its grain marked by survival as he worked. Luke thought about the community that had welcomed him despite his secretive nature, the people who'd offered help even when he'd insisted on working alone. Sarah's husband's tools, Father Miguel's historical records, Sheriff Bradley's quiet support, all of them had contributed. to a project that was larger than the sum of its parts. The memorial was no longer just about honoring the dead. It was about creating a space where the living could find connection and meaning. The benches would host conversations between strangers who discovered shared losses. The carved names would remind visitors that every life had value, regardless of social status or historical recognition. The restored mansion would stand as proof that beautiful things could emerge from devastation. Luke completed the final joint on the last bench just as midnight approached. 5 memorial benches now stood ready for installation around the mansion's restored rooms, each one representing a different aspect of the human experience of loss and love. Tomorrow would bring the town council meeting and whatever challenges that entailed. But tonight, Luke felt the satisfaction of work well done and purpose clearly understood. The handmade memorial benches represented more than furniture. They were invitations to community, carefully crafted spaces where healing could happen one conversation at a time. In the morning, Luke would begin preparing for the most important presentation of his life, knowing that the future of his memorial depended on his ability to help others see what he'd come to understand, that remembering together was the only way to truly honor those who could no longer speak for themselves. The town council meeting convened at 7 o'clock on a Thursday evening in the elementary school gymnasium, the only space in Drybone large enough to accommodate what had become the most well-attended public gathering in living memory. Luke arrived to find nearly 300 people filling folding chairs arranged in neat rows, their voices creating a low hum of anticipation and nervous energy. Martha Hayes had positioned herself in the front row, flanked by Eleanor Hastings and Dr. Patricia Reeves, the town's current physician. Behind them sat families Luke recognized from his months of quiet observation: the Morrisons, the Mackenzies, the Bradleys. But there were also faces he didn't know, people who'd driven from neighboring towns after word spread about the Medal of Honor, recipient building a memorial in their mountains. Councilman Robert Hartley called the meeting to order with the formal gravity of someone who understood the historical significance of the moment. The agenda listed only one item: discussion of proposed memorial project on private property at 1247 Maple Hill Road. Before we begin, Hartley announced, I want to establish that this is an informational meeting. The council has no legal authority to approve or deny Mr. Marrow's plans for his private property. However, we felt the community deserved an opportunity to understand the scope of this project and express their concerns or support. Luke stood when called upon, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes assessing him. He'd prepared remarks, but facing the assembled community, he decided to speak from the heart instead. 6 months ago, I came to Drybone because I was looking for a place to heal from some personal losses. I bought the Calhoun mansion because I thought restoring it might help me process my grief over my brother's family, who died in Afghanistan and Colorado, respectively. The gymnasium was absolutely silent. Luke could hear the building's heating system cycling on, the distant sound of wind in the trees outside. But as I began working on the house, I realized my grief wasn't unique. This town has lost people too, in wars, accidents, illness, and age. Some of those people are well remembered, with proper headstones and family stories passed down through generations. Others have been forgotten, their names lost to inadequate record-keeping or social prejudice. Luke paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. He saw nods of recognition, tears in some eyes, the kind of collective acknowledgement that comes when hidden truths are finally spoken aloud. What I'm building isn't just a memorial to my family or the Calhouns. It's a place where anyone who lived and died in this community can be remembered with dignity, regardless of their circumstances. A place where the forgotten can be honored alongside the celebrated. Eleanor Hastings raised her hand, and Hartley nodded for her to speak. Mr. Marrow, would you tell us about the quilt? Luke looked puzzled. I'm sorry. Eleanor smiled, with the satisfaction of someone revealing a carefully planned surprise. Ladies, would you bring it out? From the back of the gymnasium, 6 women emerged, carrying a large quilt that took Luke's breath away. The fabric was a patchwork of colors and textures, but as they unfolded it, Luke realized each square had been crafted from clothing that once belonged to someone who died. "We've been working on this for 2 months, Martha Hayes announced, standing to address the crowd. "Ever since we heard about your memorial plans. Each square represents someone from Drybone who deserves remembering." The women held the quilt high enough for everyone to see. Luke recognized fabric from Margaret Calhoun's favorite dress, material that must have come from Dr. Morrison's medical bag. Squares that looked like they'd been cut from military uniforms and work clothes and children's dresses. "There are 93 squares," Eleanor continued. 93 people whose stories we want preserved in your memorial. We've sewn messages into the backing, memories, love letters, final words that never got spoken. Sarah stood from her seat in the 3rd row. "The quilt was my idea, but it became something the whole community contributed to. Women brought fabric from relatives who'd passed. Men shared stories about friends who died too young. Children drew pictures of grandparents they'd never met." Luke found himself unable to speak. The quilt represented exactly what he'd hoped the memorial could become, a community effort to honor shared losses and preserve collective memory. "Where would it go?" he managed to ask. "Wherever you think it belongs," Martha replied. "But we were hoping it could hang in the main room of the mansion, where people could see it when they come to remember their own loved ones." Councilman Hartley cleared his throat, reclaiming control of the meeting. "This is all very touching, but we need to address practical concerns. Mr. Marrow, are you planning to open this memorial to the public? Will there be regular visiting hours? What about parking, restroom facilities, liability insurance?" Before Luke could respond, Sheriff Bradley stood up. "Robert, I think you're getting ahead of yourself. Luke hasn't said anything about turning this into a commercial operation." "But that's exactly my concern," Hartley replied. "Once word gets out about a Medal of Honor recipient's memorial, we could have tour buses coming through town. Property values could be affected, traffic patterns disrupted, our quiet way of life changed permanently." A murmur of disagreement rippled through the crowd. Dale Morrison raised his hand. "With respect, Councilman, some of us think a little recognition wouldn't hurt this town. My boy Billy's been helping Mr. Marrow with research, and he's learned more about Drybone's history in 2 months than he did in 12 years of school." "That's exactly right," added Dr. Reeves. "The memorial could be an educational resource, not just a tourist attraction. We could partner with the school district, maybe even the university in Boulder." Luke watched the debate with growing amazement. The community was taking ownership of his project, expanding it in directions he'd never imagined. But he could also see the tension between those who embraced change and those who feared it. "If I may," Father Miguel said, standing near the back of the room, "I think we're missing the most important question. Mr. Marrow, what do you need from us to complete this memorial properly?" Luke looked around the gymnasium, seeing faces that had become familiar over his months in Drybone. These people had welcomed him despite his secretive nature, offered help he'd been too proud to accept, and now were volunteering to make his project part of their community's permanent legacy. "I need your stories," he said finally. "The memorial will include carved names of people who mattered to this town, but names alone aren't enough. I need to know who they were, what they loved, how they lived, why they should be remembered. And after that," Sarah asked. Luke took a deep breath, understanding that his answer would determine not just the memorial's future, but his own relationship with the community that had given him more support than he'd known how to receive. "After that, I need you to help me figure out how this memorial can serve the community for generations to come. Because what started as one man's grief has become something much larger, and I can't build that alone." The applause began slowly, just a few people clapping. But it spread through the gymnasium like recognition itself, the sound of a community discovering its own capacity for healing, remembrance, and hope. 3 weeks later, on a crisp October morning when the aspens had turned their autumn gold and the air carried the scent of coming winter, Luke stood before the mansion's main support beam with his finest carving chisel in hand. The beam, massive oak that had survived the fire and anchored the building's restoration, would receive his final inscription. Nearly 200 people gathered in the mansion's restored rooms and on the surrounding grounds, their voices creating a gentle hum of anticipation. The memorial unveiling had grown beyond anything Luke had originally planned, not a ceremony, but a celebration of community and remembrance that felt both solemn and joyful. Sarah stood beside him, holding the bronze plaque he'd finished the night before. Father Miguel waited nearby with the community quilt, which would be permanently installed on the main room's wall. Sheriff Bradley had positioned himself near the front door, not for security, but to welcome visitors and share stories about the people whose names would be revealed. "Are you ready?" Sarah asked quietly. Luke nodded, though his hands trembled slightly as he positioned the chisel against the oak beam. The inscription would be simple but comprehensive, acknowledging both the memorial's specific purpose and its universal meaning. The first letter emerged under his careful attention: D for Drybone. The wood was hard and required patience, but Luke had learned that the most important work couldn't be rushed. Each letter had to be perfect, carved deep enough to last for generations, but shaped with enough artistry to honor the significance of the words. Rybone, he carved. The crowd growing quieter as they realized they were witnessing the creation of something permanent and meaningful. Below the town's name, Luke added the inscription that would define the memorial's purpose: "Where memory lives." The words took shape slowly, each letter a commitment to preservation and remembrance. Luke felt the weight of every story he'd collected, every name that would be honored, every family that had trusted him with their most precious memories. As he worked, people began sharing stories about their loved ones. Mrs. Henderson spoke about her son who died in Vietnam, whose name would appear on the memorial alongside the more recent losses. Billy Morrison read from a letter his great-grandfather had written during the influenza epidemic of 1918, describing the town's efforts to care for the sick and dying. When Luke completed the final letter, the crowd fell silent. The carved inscription seemed to glow in the morning light, the letters deep enough to cast shadows that made the words appear three-dimensional. Drybone, where memory lives, would greet every visitor to the memorial, promising them a place where their stories mattered, where their losses could be acknowledged, where their love could find permanent expression. Sarah stepped forward and handed Luke a brass nameplate, one final addition to the memorial that she'd commissioned without his knowledge. The plate read simply, "Dedicated by Lucas M. Marrow, in honor of all who loved and lost." "You're part of this story too," she said. "Your name belongs here with all the others." Luke accepted the nameplate with gratitude that went beyond words. For 3 years, he'd carried his grief alone, believing that healing required solitude and that remembrance was a private responsibility. But the community of Drybone had taught him that some burdens were too heavy for one person to bear, and that shared sorrow could become shared strength. He mounted the nameplate beside the main entrance, where visitors would see it as they entered the memorial space. His name would be there permanently, but not as the memorial's creator, as one more person who'd learned that love survives death, that memory transcends loss, and that healing happens best in community. The crowd began to disperse slowly, moving through the mansion's rooms to see the carved names Luke had spent months creating. Each name was accompanied by a small placard sharing basic information about the person's life and their connection to Drybone. The memorial benches provided places for quiet reflection, and the community quilt added color and warmth to the space. Father Miguel offered a simple blessing, asking that the memorial serve as a source of comfort for the grieving and inspiration for the living. Sheriff Bradley shook Luke's hand with the firm grip of respect earned rather than demanded. As the last visitors departed, Luke and Sarah walked through the mansion together, seeing their work through fresh eyes. The carved names seemed to pulse with life, each one representing a story that would now be preserved for future generations. The memorial benches invited contemplation and conversation. The community quilt transformed the space from monument to gathering place. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. Luke looked around the memorial space that had grown far beyond his original vision. "Now it belongs to the community. People will come here to remember their loved ones, to find comfort in shared loss, to understand that their stories matter. And you." Luke smiled, understanding that his time in Drybone was approaching its end, but that his connection to this place and these people would endure. "I have other places to go, other memorials to build, but this one will always be home." The mansion stood complete, transformed from burned ruin to living memorial. Luke's final carving had made it official. Drybone was now a place where memory lived, where love transcended death, and where community could transform individual grief into collective healing. The mountain man who'd arrived with nothing but cash and sorrow was leaving behind something that would serve generations yet to come. 6 months after the memorial's unveiling, Sarah Chen stood in the mansion's main room, watching a young family from Denver read the carved names with quiet reverence. The father held his daughter's hand while explaining that her grandfather's name was etched in the oak floor, part of the permanent record of lives that had mattered to this mountain community. The Calhoun Memorial, as it had come to be known, had evolved into exactly what Luke had envisioned. A living space where memory and healing intersected. Visitors came daily, some from Drybone itself, others from distant states who'd heard about the comprehensive memorial that honored not just the celebrated, but the forgotten. Sarah had become the memorial's unofficial caretaker, a role that felt like natural extension of her work as the town's librarian. She maintained the guest book where visitors could share their own stories of loss, organized the quarterly gatherings where families came to share memories, and corresponded with the steady stream of people who wanted to know if their loved ones might be eligible for inclusion in future expansions. The wooden memorial benches had proven even more important than Luke had anticipated. Sarah had watched strangers become friends while sitting together, sharing stories about parents, children, spouses, and siblings who lived on only in memory. The benches had become informal therapy spaces where grief could be spoken aloud and acknowledged by others who understood the particular weight of loss. "Excuse me," the visiting father said, approaching Sarah with careful politeness. "Could you tell us about the community quilt? My daughter was wondering about the different fabrics." Sarah smiled and led the family to the quilt, which had become one of the memorial's most popular features. Each square represents someone who lived in Drybone. This blue fabric came from a dress that belonged to Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, the town's first female physician. This plaid was cut from a shirt that belonged to a railroad worker who died in 1897, and this small square with the flowers was made from a baby blanket, a child who lived only 3 days but was loved completely. The little girl listened with the serious attention children bring to stories about people who'd lived before they were born. "Are there any kids my age?" "Several. Would you like to hear about Emma and Grace?" They were twins who loved to ski and wanted to be veterinarians when they grew up. As Sarah shared the story of Luke's nieces, she thought about the letter that had arrived that morning from New Mexico. Luke had found another project, an abandoned church in a small town where a mining accident had claimed 11 fathers, leaving their families with nowhere to properly grieve together. His letter described his plans for restoration and memorial creation, work that would honor the specific tragedy while serving the community's broader need for acknowledgement and healing. "The memorial here has become our model," Luke had written. "Every town has losses that need remembering, stories that deserve preservation. The techniques we developed in Drybone, community involvement, comprehensive research, emphasis on healing rather than just commemoration, they work. People everywhere are hungry for places where their grief can be acknowledged and their love can find permanent expression." The afternoon brought Father Miguel, who'd established a weekly tradition of reading names aloud from the memorial list, ensuring that no one was forgotten even in a space dedicated to remembrance. Today's reading included recent additions, names that had been researched and verified since the memorial's opening. People whose stories had emerged as community members, shared family histories they'd never told before. Rosa Maria Santos, Miguel read, his voice carrying clearly through the restored rooms. Born in Mexico, died in Drybone in 1902. Mother of 7 children, midwife to 3 generations of families. Known for her healing gardens and her ability to help women through difficult births. Sarah listened from the kitchen, where she was preparing coffee for the afternoon visitors. Each name Miguel read represented hours of research, interviews with elderly residents, and careful verification through church and county records. The memorial had become a catalyst for historical discovery, prompting families to share documents and photographs they'd kept private for generations. Sheriff Bradley appeared in the doorway, carrying his usual thermos and wearing the satisfied expression of someone bringing good news. Just got off the phone with the State Historical Society, he announced. They want to feature the memorial in their annual publication, not as a tourist destination, but as an example of community-based historical preservation. Sarah felt a familiar mixture of pride and protective concern. The memorial's success had brought attention they'd never sought, but it had also validated Luke's vision of remembrance as a community responsibility rather than an individual burden. What kind of feature? Mostly about the research methods, the way we've documented previously unknown residents. They're particularly interested in Dr. Morrison's story and how the memorial brought her contributions to light after a century of being overlooked. The afternoon visitors departed as evening approached, leaving Sarah alone in the memorial space that had become as familiar as her own home. She walked through the rooms slowly, reading the carved names that had become like old friends, touching the memorial benches that had hosted thousands of conversations about love and loss. The rebuilt mansion was everything Luke had promised it would be, not just a monument to the dead, but a sanctuary for the living. People came here when they needed to feel connected to something larger than their individual grief. When they wanted to understand that their stories mattered. When they sought evidence that love could survive even the most devastating loss. A knock at the front door interrupted her evening reflection. Sarah opened it to find a young woman holding a worn photograph and wearing the particular expression of someone carrying an important story. "I'm sorry to bother you so late," the woman said, "but I heard about the memorial, and I think my great-grandmother might have lived here. Her name was Catherine Wu, and she was Chinese. I have this photograph of her standing in front of a big house, and someone told me it might be this one, before the fire." Sarah invited her inside, recognizing the familiar pattern of families, discovering connections to Drybone they'd never known existed. The memorial had become a magnet for lost stories, drawing people who'd spent generations wondering about ancestors whose lives had been poorly documented or deliberately overlooked. "Let me get the research files," Sarah said. "If your great-grandmother lived here, we'll find her story and make sure it's properly preserved." As she retrieved the historical records that had grown to fill several filing cabinets, Sarah reflected on Luke's lasting gift to the community. He'd arrived as a stranger, carrying private grief, and had left behind a space where anyone's loss could find acknowledgement, where any story could be preserved, where healing happened one conversation at a time. The Calhoun Memorial stood as proof that beautiful things could emerge from devastation, that community could transform individual sorrow into collective strength, and that memory, properly tended, could become a source of hope rather than merely a reminder of loss. In the carved beam that proclaimed "Drybone, where memory lives," Luke had created more than a motto. He'd established a promise that would endure for generations yet to come. Outside, snow was beginning to fall on the mountains that surrounded the town, the same peaks that had witnessed a century and a half of human joy and sorrow. But inside the memorial, warmth and light preserved the stories of lives that had mattered, love that had endured. and the understanding that remembering together was the most sacred work any community could undertake.